What we're going to talk about is, we'll try to keep it simple and nothing too complicated. It's hot enough. So I think giving everyone a bit of room to breathe. I will try to keep it relatively short, so we'll have some time for questions in the end. But at the heart of it, what I want to focus on is that we have an obsession with data. I have a room full of data scientists. How do we go from that obsession with data to an obsession with understanding people instead? Because I think there is a lot of work to be done in that space. That's why I've titled the talk, Understand People Before You Understand Data. And we'll go through depths of what we are doing at StatusToday, what is possible in the technology, and as former, current, future, or interested data scientists, how do you approach a problem like that, which is quite a unique problem. At the heart of it, people are any organization's most valuable asset. When you think about it, people, basically us, form an organization, form the world, and we are important. But in the realm of understanding that an organization's most valuable asset is its people, we keep forgetting that people are also an organization's biggest risk. What we found as we went further and further is the average employee spends about 15 hours a month criticizing their boss. I would go as far as saying that number is underestimated. But think about it, 15 hours a month criticizing or complaining about their boss. That's a lot of time spent in complaining, being unhappy, doing things that are not necessarily in the best interest of either the individual or the employer. As you start understanding that, as you start understanding the intricacies of how people work, how people behave, you realize that there's a lot to it. When people are unhappy, they're unproductive. When people are happy, they're productive. But it's not as simple and black and white as that. What we realize at StatusToday is if we could understand workplace behavior, we could help not just the employer, but the employee. We could help people improve themselves. The mission that we put forward was we wanted to help employers, AKA managers, and employees understand each other. And to foster that understanding on every field possible, in every company on the planet, we said we will in the process build the world's largest information source of employee behavior. And within that, we would provide real-time employee analytics and artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is arguably the biggest buzzword of the last 15 years. It's more abused than any other terminology in the industry today. If I'm talking smartly, chances are I could say it's artificial intelligence because, well, the last thing I heard was someone came to me and said, we've built a coffee machine with an artificial intelligence. And I was curious why and how. And apparently, the coffee machine automatically picks the right temperature. I'm like, well, Italians perfected that like 100 years ago. Don't need artificial intelligence for that. But the idea being that I am obsessed with not talking about artificial intelligence as what we do, but how we do it. So the problem is not artificial intelligence. The solution is not artificial intelligence. It is just a means to come to an end. At StatusToday, we've built an employee insights platform that helps understand and simplify team management, helps understand people risk. As a company, and we will skip through the slide relatively quickly, we support a lot of different platforms. We've collaborated with GCHQ. We have been awarded Best AI Startup last year. And at the heart of it, we call the work we do work in the space of behavior AI, which is relatively unique by itself. As founders, me and my co-founder, Mircha, we started the company after having left our respective jobs. I left Microsoft because I got bored. It was exciting. I had a lot of fun, but I realized that there's a lot more to do. And my co-founder obviously comes from an enterprise architecture background. And over the course of the last year or 2 years, we've learned how to move forward and got recognized in various different platforms, most recently being via Forbes on 30 Under 30. I'm going to skip this slide because it's largely irrelevant. We've got some partners from different parts of the industry. And we've got some money to do what we do because it's important. But at the heart of it, it's about innovation. And I'll talk about why this innovation is really, really critical. And eventually, I will move on to a case study and talk about how we used some of the knowledge that we generated in even understanding influence in organizations. So how can you actually map people influence? There's a lot of patents at play. There's a lot of data at play. At the heart of what I'm presenting today, this represents close to 350 million human actions that have been analyzed. And that number is increasing exponentially on a daily basis at this point. So back to the problem. How do you understand human behavior? As we started digging further, we also found that highly engaged employees, people who are happy, are 87% less likely than their counterparts to be productive. Well, they're also less likely to leave. They're also less likely to do bad things. Across the board, it helps understanding them. But the future of work, the future of the workplace has transformed. As you look forward, you realize that it's no longer working in the office from 9 to 5, using their work computer. Everything's changed. Flexible working is now the new way of working. A lot of companies don't realize flexible working is not the same as remote working. So when you think about flexible working, it is not about letting people go home and work. Flexible working means the hours at which you work is not fixed. The place at which you work is not fixed. The device with which you work is not fixed. And the work you do itself is not fixed. So you might argue that what's the role of a job description in the future, but that's a different conversation. I'll play a video that we created recently in that space on why any of this is relevant. Let's see if it plays.
Today's world, we are constantly influenced by data. The sources and mechanisms by In today's world, we are constantly influenced by data. The sources and mechanisms by which we collect and use data vary widely. From devices that track our heart rates and how we're sleeping, to those that measure the number of steps we've taken or how much alcohol we've consumed, there is a trending belief that gathering and analysing data about our everyday activities can help us improve our habits and lives. So why should our work lives be any different? Many companies have seen the potential for data-driven improvements in the workplace. Huge amounts of data collected by companies to determine large-scale activity patterns and employees promise to save organizations money, increase talent retention, and improve strategy. But just what does this data mean to you as an individual? Employee analytics, like your step tracker or heart rate monitor, translate data to individual performance improvement by raising unbiased quantitative self-awareness. Customized dashboards display your daily activity patterns so you can pinpoint when you are the most active in the day or when you experience a long inactivity. This knowledge can inform how you structure your days, empowering you to make the most of your productive hours and set goals to improve downturns in activity. Communication insights, such as email activity, ensure you know exactly how many emails you're sending and receiving, and the amount of time it takes you to receive responses and reply. All of these personal metrics can be compared to your company average and across industry standards, so you know where you stand in relation to others. Artificial intelligence recognizes and alerts you to any changes in your work behavior so you can be well aware if you stray from your normal activity and when your targeted efforts for improvement are paying off. Insights provided by employee analytics platforms, such as StatusToday, help employees stay informed on their activity, triggering actions that positively impact productivity. Self-knowledge is the first key to self-improvement, and we know this is an invaluable asset in the workplace.
So then going into more details, the technical details. How is it that you go about understanding behavior in the workplace? Behavior in the workplace is a multidimensional matter. It's not easy to understand. It's not easy to model. So what is the beginning? The beginning is an assumption. The assumption that we made, which is we as humans are predictably unique. We are unique. We do things that make us who we are, each and every one of us. But within certain parameters, within a certain confined parameters, we are very predictable. If you're a salesperson working in a bank in London, in the city, doing your hours, I can reliably predict that your average working week has probably more than 60 hours in it. If you're a data scientist in London working for a startup, I can reliably predict that you probably attend a few meetups and a few events here and there. You can take this parameter quite a long way, and you can add to that behavior psychology. Because at that point, what you get is essentially thousands of years of research combined into modern data science. That is truly powerful. Because what comes out of that is the understanding that at the workplace, human behavior can be combined and modeled using a few signals. You don't need to know a lot of things. You do not need to monitor the employee. What you can instead do is understand communication, understand devices, understand files, so content. And between these parameters, you're actually able to model what does the average day look like. Something as trivial as what is the distribution of the average day is incredibly straightforward to model at this point. So this is what the average day in most companies looks like. It is a 24-hour distribution. As you can see, there's a lot of activity happening right at the onset in the morning. And when you go further down from there, there's a small dip during the lunchtime. And the lunchtime dip, arguably, is, well, expected. But it's not very prominent because different people take lunches at different times. You can see that it's spread over a period of 2 hours. As the evening comes in, it goes back up. One of the more interesting things this tells us, and this is an incredibly simple graph, is the fact that there's more activity happening in the second half of the day, in the evenings, after work, at 9 p.m., than it would be at 4 a.m. It seems intuitive, but data tells us that and confirms that, and you can use that to make further analysis. It's actually true that more people work after hours in the evening than they work at 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning. You can inform decision-making once you understand that, not just for the individual, but question that comes after that, which is how does this vary between different individuals? So as you go further, you're actually able to model activities across different types of individuals. So as you start collapsing this information into different roles, different personas, what you understand is people are different. An administrative assistant does not work from home, does not do remote working, does not do after hours. Therefore, their activity, as you can see on top, is relatively stable through the day. It fluctuates hour on hour, but there is no hourly pattern emerging over the different times of the day. But when you look at, for instance, a salesperson, their activity does show these patterns. They do have those late evening emails with clients. They do have the odd before coming to work that's coming on. They do have a dip in the middle, and they do have the end of the day rush, which doesn't normally exist for an administrative assistant. And then you look at programmers. Well, arguably, if the data is to be believed, morning is not a time they like to work. But the reality is that's not true. Data is always to be read in context. Actually, if anything, this tells me that the morning is when they're being a bit more productive. Because now if you think about the fact that the data we are modeling is essentially the digital footprint of the employee in the workplace via the methods like, let's say, email or, let's say, workplace systems, then a developer not being active is a good thing. A salesperson not being active is a bad thing. So a developer showing increased signs or programmer showing increased signs of digital activity is almost certainly not good. You want them to code. You want them to focus. Whereas a salesperson who's not sending emails is an incredibly bad thing because, well, what are they doing? So effectively, what you end up with is the understanding that data doesn't talk. People do. And when you take data outside the context, it could mean completely different things. This exact same information helps you identify what time of the day should you go and disturb your technical folks in the company, and what time of the day are they actually really busy. So if anything, this tells me that in the just after lunch period for the developers and programmers, they're actually active online, if I could call it that. That is the time I should go and talk to them. That is the time I should send the emails. That is the time I can schedule meetings, because they are OK with that. You can take this significantly further from the two-dimension to the multidimensional approach that we took right on the left. So on the left, what you see is a distribution of activity across different types of activity: content, file, communication, and how does that change? That shape is relatively unique to each individual, to each group, to each company, and to each industry. But within that uniqueness lies a pattern that you can inform and learn on top of. One might argue that this doesn't sound groundbreaking. This does not sound crazy. It sounds incredibly straightforward, which is why we look at the case of workplace analytics. It is a space that is exploding right now. It is a space that's emerging. Being able to understand the workplace at scale is incredibly important. It's a fantastic mission. There are companies who are out there doing it. There are research groups who are doing it. But it's very limited on its ability to use artificial intelligence. It's very limited in its ability to use machine learning. At the heart of everything we show is the fact that you can use machine learning not always to predict, but actually to understand. And what I mean by that relatively fluffy statement is the fact that even something like the average day requires, as data scientists you would know, cleaning of data, trimming the edges, understanding outliers, modeling the groups, clustering people. All of that are capabilities that machine learning provides at scale. Bring in a bit more intelligence to it, and you're reliably able to say, how are the patterns changing? And that change and the understanding of change can be dramatically useful for any organization. Most of the historical approach has been very statistical. Why do I care how many emails I'm sending on any given day? That doesn't make sense. But what does make sense is if I understood how many emails I'm sending relative to the organization or the groups of people I work with. What does help is understanding that the number of emails I'm sending on any given day is increasing, and that the amount of responses I'm getting in return is decreasing. That might reflect that I'm burning out because I'm sending more and I'm making more mistakes. My emails are less effective. My communication is inefficient. Therefore, while I think I'm doing more work, I'm actually doing less. Those are things that you can inform when you start applying good modeling techniques behind the scene. Also, when you start understanding core patterns, you're able to detect mistakes. People make mistakes. That is normal. When people make mistakes, data talks. But being able to understand that there might have been a mistake is incredibly useful because you can inform, again, the individual, the organization, that, you know what, there's very likely to be X number of mistakes. Something as simple as, well, it might look like you might have accidentally deleted files. You might have accidentally sent the wrong emails. You might have accidentally communicated with the wrong people. Or for other comparisons, there might be activity from your account in the cyber territory. You might have been impersonated, hacked. All of them, intrinsically, if you just look at anomalous activity, you will find anomalous activity. But if you look at normal behavior, what you find is a deviation. And that deviation can be incredibly useful. So instead of focusing on the alert, you focus on what lies below the alert. And that is a useful thing to look at. In that context, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a deep dive into a technical case study. So we will talk about a demo data set that I have taken, and we will model influence. Influence is arguably the single biggest measure of employee engagement in the workplace, in our opinion. So what we did is we took this demo data set, and based on the communication, based on the file activity, we were able to map an organizational graph behind the scene. So for instance, if you are working on content that the CEO of the company is also working on, in a very weird way, you're close to the CEO. You don't talk to the person, but you're 2 degrees away. So degree of separation. But degree of separation for the first time ever, not done using people, but using objects, entities, a person, a file, a machine, whatever that might be. You take that approach to start figuring out how do people rank in any given capacity. So take Google. Google PageRank the entire internet. It said the value of a page is a function of what it contains and who refers to it. That's a very rudimentary way of calling it out. And that value changes dynamically every day, every hour, every minute. So it's not fixed. It is real time. You take that approach in the organization because an organization is effectively a network of people doing a network of things all the time in real time, and you see that evolving. So we modeled one of the influence features on the graph exclusively on inbound communication within the company. So companies receiving inbound client communication, customer communication, so on and so forth. What that allowed us to do was it allowed us to look at individual influence values over the last 60 days, which is using the approach of you are a function of people you connect into, you are a function of communication that comes to you. But in turn, it's not just about how much or how many, it's about who. So if you're getting communication inbound from someone who's a super connector, then you effectively increase your connectivity. If you're talking to someone who's an incredibly great talker, then your talking points kind of go up. If you are connected to people who are very well connected in the organization distance-wise, then that means your distance from you to any other employee in the organization has just decreased. So it is the idea that if you take a graph of the company at any given point of time and take any individual, you can measure attributes about that individual in that graph. So let's take a look at two specific employees in this particular case. So we'll take a look at Christopher and Carson. Carson is a salesperson and Christopher is a tradesman. What we found was that what we call Eigen Influence in our case, because it's essentially an eigenvector at the heart of it, that for Carson, we had an influence score, which is a score we calculate from 0 to 1, 1 being incredibly high and unlikely anyone ever gets, and 0 being non-existent. So we found that Carson had a score of 0.01 and Christopher 0.002. Doesn't have to mean anything because the score by itself is a normalized number. Therefore, that number doesn't hold much significance, but relatively speaking, that number means a lot of things. So let me show you a few different things about these individuals. So let's look at Christopher. Christopher is the tradesman. As you look at Christopher, what you're looking at right now on the left is Christopher's communication graph. This graph represents communication with different entities and different people. And within the space of the workplace, this is something Christopher might be aware of, but it allows you to understand how is the communication distributed. So you're looking at individuals, you're looking at files, you're looking at who are the second degree connectivity and nodes for Christopher. So the first row and first circle of nodes are people that are in direct contact with Christopher. And the second degree would be people who in touch are the top people that communicate with that first degree circle. So it gives you the network, the second degree network that Christopher was living in for that particular snapshot of time. That, when you model on a day-to-day basis, allows you to score the influence. And when you do that, on the right, at the bottom, you see the evolution of the influence. And this is where the true value starts to emerge, because it's not the value that is interesting. It is the fact that you can see in the last 2 months, there's been a very sustained and significant increase in this. And that means something. That could mean a variety of different things. In the context of the work, that could mean that the role has changed. And usually when the role changes, your influence changes because you are holding a different position in the organization. It might mean that the person is, over time, gradually getting more connected, which might be a case of new employee becoming not so new of an employee. But more significantly, when you see at the end, there is quite a significant bump going up. We don't know what that is. And that doesn't just happen. Human psychology tells us incredibly conclusively that people don't change overnight. We all know that. When you do this at a group level, it has the ability to detect patterns like systemic problems in workplace stress, systemic problems in people efficiency, systemic burnout in people. And you can detect that not at an individual level. You can detect that at a cohort level. Being able to say the London office has engineers who are consistently working 50, 60, 70, 80 hours. We got to do something about it. That consistently is the one word that's difficult to detect. Everything else is actually pretty easy. Let's look at Christopher's graph in a bit more detail. And as you look at it, you realize Christopher did start connecting with, over the last few months, people or individuals who are a bit more connected than everyone else. So you start connecting to what I call super connectors, people who just seem to be very well connected in the organization. And his score effectively went up. As we do the same analysis for Carson, it presents a completely different picture. Carson is a salesperson in our demo data. You can see Carson's graph is incredibly crowded, talks to a lot of people. You expect that, salesperson. Second degree is relatively powerful as well. And as you look at the influence scores over the last 60 days, you realize that it hasn't changed much except the fact that there's a massive peak in the middle, and then it drops down. It drops down not to a point that is historically inaccurate. In fact, it comes down to where it used to be, which basically leads us to believe that that particular period of increase must have been a project, a conference, or something along the lines, something outbound. Incredibly different personalities, incredibly different style of change. One is consistent, linear, slow, and gradual, and this is anything but gradual or consistent. Again, when you put them side by side, it finally allows you to see how different the individuals are. But the funny thing is, we know nothing about them. We know nothing about them. We know not what they do in terms of personal life. We don't know their personality. We do not have any custom data on them. All we know is the metadata that is dropped in the workplace network. So for instance, I don't know if Carson spends 10 hours a day on Facebook, or whether he works 2 hours or 20 hours, or whether he's flexibly working or not. But I know what Carson's output at the workplace looks like. And the same for Christopher. Using that, I can then tag people as a company. I can say I have a team that is remote working. I want to understand how remote working impacts connectivity, and I can map that to basically effectively understand whether that connectivity has changed or has not. You start going into the space of employee intelligence that actually can be exposed not just to the manager, but this information can be invaluable to the employee. You can tell the employee that, look, something's happening. You might or might not be aware of it, but we've noticed your connectivity has changed dramatically. We noticed that you're starting to develop signs of email stress. Email stress is arguably one of the strongest indicators of burnout at the workplace. And stress is not just a function of what you're doing, but how and when you're doing. Are there people in the organization who are consistently and reliably writing to you late in the evening, expecting a response, in the weekend, expecting a response on a relatively regular basis? So while they're increasing your connectivity, we will detect the fact that those are what we call stress creators. They should not do that. They feel they're being productive because from their side, they're doing 20-hour work days or whatever that might be. But in effect, they're causing a downstream stress problem in the organization. As you can see, they're very different in their communication pattern as well. Their network, this is their workplace network, looks dramatically different from each other. And that is a very valuable thing to understand. Unsurprisingly, the influence scores for them also varies quite a lot. So while for Christopher, we get a score that's 0.02, for Carson, we get 0.01, or 0.002 for Christopher, for that matter. And that is correct, because Carson is more connected, is more intertwined in the workplace network. And Christopher is a bit more isolated in that context. But this is where the disclaimers lie, that they probably are not comparable. Christopher doesn't have the goal to get Carson's influence in this case because they're different. And that's why when you start mapping it up into buckets that do make sense. So what about other tradesmen? What about other salespeople? You realize that people are relatively stable in groups. So of course, salespeople will show higher signs of connectivity. And of course, developers will show lower signs of connectivity because that's not the measure of their work. And that's why you look at this in context. And that's what I started with, that when you look at the average day, for a technical person, the average day in the digital side of things will be completely opposite in their fingerprint to a person who's very heavy on communication, because you need to understand what is it that they're doing and what defines productivity. So while productivity for someone might mean quiet hours, while productivity for the design team might mean their ability to think, productivity for an office manager almost certainly does not mean in their ability to go and reflect and spend 3 hours in meetings thinking about stuff. Productivity for an office manager is almost certainly reflected in micro-transactional output, which would be very easily visible. So the measurement of productivity is an incredibly varied thing. In that context, obviously, what's next with us? We are looking at things like leaderboard, collaboration. We are looking at things like wellness, efficiency. Can we detect people who are spamming? So, in the context of efficiency, who are the spammers internal to the organization? Who are the people who consistently send communication, don't receive responses to those communications, and are essentially just creating massive noise in the system? We're all aware of people who are writing emails for no good reason. We're all aware of people who are creating files for no good reason. We can decrease that. Then it goes into the space of efficiency. We did that with StatusToday. We mapped our own company, and we do that on a real-time basis every day. This was the physical footprint of the data that we saw for the last year. We know our team travels, but it's just reassuring to understand that we don't see countries that we're not particularly unaware of. The typical 24-hour day for an intern in the company so far in 2018 has been pretty interesting for us, mostly because everything makes sense except that we at Spike at 5 p.m. We're not entirely sure about that, to be fair. But our assumption is that before they leave for home, they try to get stuff done. Data scientists, incredibly clean model where we're looking at a very significant dip. Our entire data science team has lunch together, always, all the time. You can see that. It's very, very visible. And, well, this is senior management in the company. It is exactly what it is, and it looks the same as what we expected it to. Yes, they do work for the better part of it 24 hours a day. And there are times that they worked early hours, late hours. The difference between 9 p.m. to 3 p.m. is actually not as dramatic as for some other people, because the amount of work that happens in the evening is quite significant, and that is normal as well. Which is why it is important to understand the normal. You can use the methodology, you can use the data, data science, data techniques, machine learning, artificial intelligence to map this out. As you map it out, it gives you the ability to understand engagement patterns on how people behave, how people communicate, without looking at the communication itself, without reading their emails, without intercepting their activity. That then allows you to identify areas of improvement for the individual, for the organization, and as we go forward for the industry. You could make entire companies accountable. You could make companies transparent. You could make companies accountable to the point to say your company is doing worse on employee wellness than this other company. What are you doing about it? Because that creates that level of accountability. Sharing that core pattern allows for a level of employee intelligence that finally allows employers to do something about the core problems at work, be it burnout, be it wellness, be it efficiency, be it spammers, things that actually turn the needle and do something, rather than just detecting who are the employees doing suspicious activity, which I don't think necessarily helps. But it does also allow you to detect precursors to mistakes, precursors to systemic problems in performance, and precursors to people doing bad things. Because people are often making mistakes, but every once in a while, there are bad employees who do very bad things, and it's important to safeguard against that as well. Using that level of employee insights or employee intelligence really allows for an efficient and transparent workplace. Transparency is not about thinking that you know what's going on. Transparency is about building an objective system of truth. Why shouldn't you be aware of what your manager is doing? Why should the manager only know what you're doing? Why shouldn't you be aware of what is the average day in the life of your manager looks like? That builds that trust. If you knew that you never saw your manager in the office because the manager was doing 15-hour days, then you'll probably stop questioning the person as much, which is probably a good thing. On that note, I'm going to plug in and say we are hiring DevOps, data science, and JavaScript at this point, two in particular. Join us, refer to us. But more critically, that's where I stop. The mission that we have, that we've had for a long time, is understand people before you understand data, which is the whole point of the company and what we're building. We do, I believe, have 5 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, for questions. So we'll probably get to one or two. So let's go into questions. Thank you. Yeah?
You point, I bring the mic.
Okay. No, go ahead.
I think you're very interesting. To what extent the data generated at the workplace are subject to the GDPR regulation?
It's not a black and white answer, that question, when it comes to workplace data, for the specific reason that, let me put it this way, the simple answer is yes, it is subject to GDPR. The complicated answer is that it doesn't apply in the same way as consumer data. Because if you're sending an email using your work email account to a client, the employer has a need to know. Because if you send the client email something, the wrong contract, then there's a workplace reasoning. in that context, also the right to the free consent that's given in GDPR, that people should consent to exactly what they're giving, is also not incredibly valid, because you don't get the choice. If it's in your employment contract, then it's effectively a condition of employment, then it's not a free consent. So a lot of the core provisions kind of fall apart in the employment-employee conversation. That said, that has been addressed. Pretty much all the pieces of data, as long as they're metadata and as long as they're not going into content, still constitute personal information for the employee. And they should be transparent, they should be disclosed. Every employer should explicitly call out what are the things they're collecting. So everything I showed you today is based on data that every employer has been collecting for arguably the last 15 years.
But then if it's personal data, that means that I need to kind of anonymize them or not be able to identify the person to build a profile.
GDPR does not force you to anonymize. The purpose of GDPR is not to say that everyone should be anonymized. The purpose of GDPR is anonymize if I don't know. But if I do know, tell me and take my approval. GDPR doesn't stop us from doing things. GDPR creates a bigger sense of accountability. So most employers would already have this consent in the employment and would ask that we need to make sure that you're doing your job. But then how far do you go? What are the ethical implications of that? And I think there's a much bigger question there, which probably we shouldn't address right now. Questions?
Thanks for your talk. I wouldn't work for a company who collects this data. In a sense, like, I think what it creates this sense of being observed on a constant basis, where you have to kind of actually have a negative impact when you think about, am I connected enough? And I sending enough emails? And then when you say like that you discover something new about employees, I think the level of data you collect, you not discover truth, you create them. So it's kind of, it didn't exist before, but like you have this data and you create some sort of, how do you say, like ideas that might be behind it. So
so this is the beauty of this. If you look at, so there are two parts to this. One is, as I said, every company that has existed that is using a core Microsoft or Google technology, meaning Office 365 or Google Suite, is already collecting this data. This is collected implicitly by default on normal practice, which is not a surprise. All the workplace suites are now going into a space called workplace analytics, which is going to become the norm in less than 2 years at the speed at which it is being adopted. The question then becomes is, how do you use this information? Because if this information is going to be mainstream and present, then do you use this to drive change? Do you use this to identify problems? Or do you use this to spy on people? And I think that becomes procedural. So for instance, if we use this to identify stress, wellness, and burnout issues, well, that's great. But how can you identify stress and burnout if you don't know what's going on? So it's a two-sided problem. I mean, if you want to solve a problem, you need information. But to get that information, you'll look at things that you probably don't want to look at. But then that information that you look at does have other use cases. And yes, you can use it to detect other things that you probably don't want to look at. So what is the regulatory framework? What are the transparent things? The way we solved it is we said, we will open the platform for the employee directly. So your employer can log in and see what's going on, but the employee can log in and see what's going on. So suddenly it kind of becomes a two-sided system. And there's a very interesting conversation there about what is the role of transparency and privacy against each other? How compatible are they? And we think they're very compatible, because the general argument is that the more transparent you are, the less you respect privacy. But the reality is you can be very respectful of privacy by distinguishing personal life and professional life. So yes, if you send a nude picture to a client, the company has every right to know and stop you. But no, if you spend 3 hours a day on Facebook, the company has no business knowing. How do you differentiate that at an architectural level is the question. And I think that is a really, really hard question to answer. But it is a very important question every AI startup needs to address. I think that's the end of time. Thank you for listening.